Good morning, everyone. It's now late May, and all around us the flowers are blooming. I had the pleasure of seeing a lot of spring bloom in and around Topeka before I moved here to Pennsylvania, and here I'm seeing more of them. Dramatic, big blooming rhododendrons in various pink hues, and Japanese iris, as well as the final azaleas of the season. The roses are about to burst forth, and the lilacs, long finished in Kansas, are still lingering here. The dogwoods, too, they were resplendent last week, although they're now fading. I've seen none of the redbuds, which light up the woods and neighborhoods of Kansas, but all places have their own version of spring blossom, and that's a great thing if you like the outdoors in the springtime. So today I thought it might be appropriate to read poems having to do with flowers and fruits and such matters. And I tried to pick poems that may have more than one set of meanings. And I'm going to start with one of my own. It's called The Flower. This faded flower holds its head still high, even while the stem and roots both dry and the scent that once beguiled is gone. Look twice and see the bloom is done. All this so gradually, the nutrients and water lovingly renewed. Our eyes sought her as her bloom had smiles to offer each and all. Shall we press the petals twixt some pages small? We have it safely fitted in a photophone. But whence the scent that once beguiled, now gone? This life of yours and mine is fading too. It seems as transient as the morning dew. It should be lasting longer than the mindless gold that's valued more and more as it grows old. Okay, I hope that'll give you a little food for thought. Perhaps a metaphor is somebody in your own family. But poems about flowers were great favorites of the English Romantic poets such as William Wordsworth. And so I'm going to, if I can find it, I'm going to read one called I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. And what do you know? I just found it. Don't be too hard on me. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance. Tossing their heads in sprightly dance, the waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. I think it's a lovely poem. I'm not much of a fan of Wordsworth. He had a lot of breathless poems from a time when the English countryside was large and varied, and before the days of the enclosures of the country farms and the weavers sent off to work for very bad wages in the great new industrial factories of England. And in London itself, the smog began. And it did not go away until after World War II, when it began killing more Brits than the Germans did. And then they cleaned up their act. It took more than 100 years. But that's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud by William Wordsworth. Now, I'm going to finish up with a somewhat longer poem by Robert Frost. And you'll note the story of a family, the Lorens, and it's told entirely by dialogue between a husband and wife who are their neighbors. I'm not going to identify the lines where the husband and wife are speaking. I think you'll be able to tell the difference. It starts with stanza spoken by the husband, and then the second person in the dialogue comes in with just one line, and that's the wife. And then it goes on from there, changing stanzas between speakers, and the speakers are always either the husband or the wife, and you should be able to tell which speaker is speaking. The poem is called Blueberries. Blueberries. It's an odd sort of narrative. It's a husband and wife talking almost exclusively about another family called the Lorens, who are seen through the eyes of these neighbors that are carrying on the dialogue. And I don't think the poem is trying to teach us anything, but you will be able to get an idea of the character of the people involved. If you remember that this poem took place in Vermont many, many years ago, and I'll explain some of the terminology after I've read the poem. Here it is. Blueberries. You ought to have seen what I saw on my way to the village through Patterson's pasture today. Blueberries as big as the end of your thumb. Real, sky blue and heavy and ready to drum in the cavernous pail of the first one to come. And all ripe together, not some of them green and some of them ripe. You ought to have seen. I don't know what part of the pasture you mean. You know where they cut off the woods? Let me see. It was 2 years ago, or no, can it be no longer than that? And the following fall, the fire ran and burned it all up but the wall. Why, there hasn't been time for the bushes to grow. That's always the way with blueberries, though. There may not have been the ghost of a sign of them anywhere under the shade of the pine, but get the pine out of the way, you may burn the pasture all over until not a fern or grass blade is left. not to mention a stick. And presto! They're up all around you, as thick and hard to explain as a conjurer's trick. It must be on charcoal they fatten their fruit. I taste in them sometimes the flavor of soot. And after all, really, they're ebony-skinned, the blue's but a mist from the breath of the wind, a tarnish that goes at the touch of the hand, and less than the tan with which pickers are tanned. Does Patterson know what he has, do you think? He may, and not care, and so leave the chewink to gather them for him. You know what he is. He won't make the fact that they're rightfully his an excuse for keeping us other folk out. I wonder you didn't see Lauren about. The best of it was that I did. Do you know, I was just getting through what the field had to show and over the wall and into the road when who should come by with a Democrat load of all the young chattering Laurens alive, but Lauren, the fatherly, out for a drive. He saw you then. What did he do? Did he frown? He just kept nodding his head up and down. You know how politely he always goes by. But he thought a big thought. I could tell by his eye, which being expressed might be this in effect. I have left those there berries, I shrewdly suspect, to ripen too long. I am greatly to blame. He's a thriftier person than some I could name. He seems to be thrifty. And hasn't he need, with the mouths of all of those young Laurens to feed? He has brought them all up on wild berries, they say, like birds. They store a great many away. They eat them the year round, and those they don't eat they sell in the store and buy shoes for their feet. Who cares what they say? It's a nice way to live, just taking what nature is willing to give, not forcing her hand with harrow and plow. I wish you had seen his perpetual bow and the air of the youngsters. Not one of them turned, and they looked so solemn, absurdly concerned. I wish I knew half what the flock of them know, of where all the berries and other things grow, cranberries in bogs and raspberries on top of the boulder-strewn mountain, and when they will crop. I met them one day, and each had a flower stuck into his berries as fresh as a shower. Some strange kind. They told me it hadn't a name. I've told you how once, not long after we came, I almost provoked poor Lauren to mirth by going to him, of all people on earth, to ask if he knew any fruit to be had for the picking. The rascal. He said he'd be glad to tell if he knew, but the year had been bad. There had been some berries, but those were all gone. He didn't say where they had been. He went on, I'm sure, as polite as could be. He spoke to his wife in the door. Let me see, Mame. We don't know any good berrying place. It was all he could do to keep a straight face. If he thinks all the fruit that grows wild is for him, he'll find he's mistaken. See here, for a whim, we'll pick in the Pattersons' pasture this year. We'll go in the morning, that is, if it's clear. And the sun shines. The vines must be wet. It's so long since I picked, I almost forget how we used to pick berries. We took one look round, then sank out of sight like trolls underground, and saw nothing more of each other or heard unless when you and I was keeping a bird away from its nest, and I said it was you. Well, one of us is. For complaining, it flew around and around us, and then for a while we picked, till I feared you had wandered a mile, and I thought I had lost you. I lifted a shout, too loud for the distance you were. It turned out, for when you made answer, your voice was as low as talking. You stood up beside me, you know. We shan't have the place to ourselves to enjoy, not likely when all the young Lorens deploy. They'll be there tomorrow or even tonight. They won't be too friendly. They may be polite, for people they look on as having no right to pick where they're picking. But we won't complain. You ought to have seen how it looked in the rain, the fruit mixed with water in layers of leaves, like two kinds of jewels, a vision for thieves. A poem like that delights us in more ways than one. The chewink bird mentioned is a critter who has an appetite for berries, and a Democrat load, which reminds me of every speech by President Biden, actually refers to a kind of wagon with no top. In the 19th century, it was a very low-priced wagon, and it was versatile. You could remove the rear two seats. It was a four-seater wagon, and then you had plenty of room with the small space behind to carry quite a load of goods as well as children. Well, there it is. Your poems about spring and flowers and other things. This sets the stage for Memorial Day, which is coming up soon, when traditionally we remember the dead, especially our war dead, and visit the graves, put down flowers. But of course, that was more common in the last century, in the middle part of it, when I was a little boy, and World War II was on. Nobody moved much anyplace, and it was common to have an urn full of flowers by the graves of your predecessors, your predeceased loved ones. And each spring, at least in Iowa, it would be planted anew with annuals, and it had a place in the lower part where you could put at least a half bucket of water, which would be gradually taken up during the week. And then if you went every week, you could keep the flowers alive through the summer months. And I remember it as a ritual of growing up. But of course, in the modern world, we are every place and no place. We are every place online, and often no place in reality except our own bedroom or living room or office space. And yet we can communicate like we never could before. So we have to live in the world in which we are born, and we may look back with longing on worlds long gone, but I think we have to learn to like the one we're in, don't we? Otherwise, life can be pretty sad. Okay, that's it for today, and I'm thinking of all of you, and I hope you'll be with me next week for another poetry reading session. Bye now.